It's officially the Bime again, and fantasy managers will need to dig deep this week as Bijan Robinson, James Cook, Chase Brown, Travis Etienne, Alvin Kamara, and Breece Hall are all forced to sit out of your fantasy football lineups. With all those backs on bye, fantasy managers must feel like this is the week before Christmas, and I'm not talking about all the pleasantries. I'm talking about when you're completely broke and all you can afford to do is window shop. That being said, we will do our best here to help you avoid getting grinched and spread a little bit of pre-holiday cheer with the RotoBaller Week 12 starts and sits at the running back position. Starting with those fantasy football booms and starting with Tyrone Tracy Jr. of the New York Giants as they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. With a change at quarterback, a spark of life can return to this Giants offense. On Monday, we learned that Daniel Jones would be benched in favor of fan favorite Tommy DeVito. And yes, Drew Lock will be the backup quarterback, meaning Daniel Jones has now been relegated to third string quarterback. That means there's a good chance we are going to get a Cooper Rush, Tommy DeVito, Thanksgiving Day showdown in just a few weeks' time. Now, okay, enough of the Tommy DeVito talk. Let's talk about Tracy. Between weeks 5 through 10, Tracy has produced 89.2 fantasy points. That is the 10th most amongst the running back position, averaging 14.9 fantasy points per game. Don't look now, but heading into the Week 11 bye, the Giants held the second best rushing EPA in the league since Tracy took over his backfield, something that the fantasy production confirmed. Tracy has displayed explosive playmaking ability, one that has been showcased by the 4.7% of his carries going for greater than 20 yards, including that 33-yard touchdown run in Munich the last time that we saw him in action. This week, the Giants face a Buccaneers team that has allowed a league-high 29.05 fantasy points per game to opposing backs over the last 4 weeks. In those 4 weeks, Tampa, they've surrendered 642 total yards and 5 touchdowns. Let's stick with this Giants-Buccaneers showdown and let's talk about Bucky Irving, shall we? Tampa Bay, they may not be great when it comes to defending the run. Heck, they're even worse when it comes to defending opposing running backs in the passing game. The one thing that we do know, that the New York Giants, they're not much better when it's all said and done. Over the last 4 weeks, the Giants have allowed backs to run for 679 yards and haul in 15 receptions for 109 yards. The disparity in the rushing yards allowed versus the receiving yards allowed to the position allows us to lean more towards Bucky Irving rather than Rachaad White this week in this week's start list, although both backs are certainly serviceable this week. Since week number 6, Irving has averaged 14.9 fantasy points per game, which had him as the RB15 over that period. Irving has also averaged 5.1 yards per carry this season and has scored a touchdown in 3 of his last 5 contests. For a team like the New York Giants, who have been giving it up on the ground, Irving is probably the last back that they wanted to see. When you look at the data leading up to the Buccaneers bye, I'm talking about missed tackles, forced versus scrimmage yards per touch. Only James Conner has proven to be more elusive in the run game than Irving. And my final start of the week, how about Aaron Jones of the Minnesota Vikings as they take on the Chicago Bears? Let's focus on these great matchups when it comes to fantasy production. Last week, we saw what Josh Jacobs was capable of doing to this Chicago Bears defense. He posted a top 5 fantasy week for running backs, accumulating 22 fantasy points. In that game, Jacobs would average 4.2 yards per carry, score a touchdown, and catch 5 passes for 58 yards. Now, Chicago, they have allowed 24.87 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. And Aaron Jones, he presents a very similar skill set to the one that they saw with Josh Jacobs just a week ago. In 10 games this season, Jones sits second on the Vikings with 29 receptions and third on the team with 262 receiving yards. Add his receiving total to his rushing total, and Jones is averaging 95.4 scrimmage yards per game, and that is the 10th most amongst running backs. While Jones is no longer what we call a bell cow, the matchup is too good to pass up. Consider Jones a solid RB2 this week. Now let's look at those fantasy football busts. Let's talk about those running backs who you maybe should temper your expectations or completely send off to your bench this week. And I'm going to start with one of my favorites, Ramondre Stevenson. Yes, I know I love to hate on Stevenson every single week, but hey, I'm okay with admitting that this Patriots offense has looked more like an offense since Drake May has taken over in center. But we also have to admit that this matchup against the Miami Dolphins has become much more difficult in recent weeks. Miami has allowed just the 8th fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. Second, sometimes fantasy points, they lie. Numbers lie. I'm going to prove it to you right now. In weeks 8 through 11, Stevenson, he ranks 8th when it comes to fantasy points, averaging 16.9 fantasy points per game. In those 4 contests, though, Stevenson has 4 total touchdowns, despite not averaging more than 3.7 yards per carry in any one of those 4 games. Now, you have to go back all the way to week number 5 to find a game in which Stevenson averaged more than 3.7 yards per carry. While Stevenson scoring a touchdown this week isn't completely off the table, it's not something that I'm willing to bet on. The game script is likely to limit Stevenson to just the passing game, which does limit his opportunities to a degree. Consider the Patriots back to be a low-end RB2 or a flex option this week. Speaking of flex options, a guy who's been flexing plenty this season, except not so much last week, is DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears, and this week they are taking on the Minnesota Vikings. I mentioned that Jones is no longer considered what we call a bell cow. It was odd to see DeAndre Swift's carry share dip below 60%, yes, 58.3% last week in what was a highly contested contest. I mean, this was a close game. Even his 10.7 weighted opportunities were his lowest total since the opening week of the season. What grinds fantasy managers' gears? How about Rashawn Johnson handled 3 of the 4 carries inside the 10-yard line? If not for that 39-yard touchdown run, Swift's day, it would have been a disaster, as he averages 2.46 yards per carry outside of that one run. This week, it doesn't get any easier facing a Vikings team that's allowing just 16.79 fantasy points per game. That is the second fewest in the league, trailing only the Kansas City Chiefs. The bottom line is, it comes down to opportunities. In new offensive coordinator Shane Waldron's first game calling plays, the Bears' backfield was an even split. Swift, he held the 41-30 edge as far as snaps are concerned over Johnson. However, routes and opportunities were even closer, with a slight edge going in Swift's favor, 18-12 in routes and 16-11 in opportunities. Now, another back who's had plenty of opportunities this season, but a guy I'm sitting this week is Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers as they take on the aforementioned Kansas City Chiefs. I mentioned that the only defense tougher on opposing running backs than the Minnesota Vikings this season has been the Kansas City Chiefs, so it's only right that the back who's happening to face the Kansas City Chiefs earns a place on your bench this week. While Hubbard will see a majority of the touches, he will give way to both Jonathan Brooks there and Miles Sanders at times, especially if he isn't fully healed from that knee sprain that he suffered back in week number 10. However, despite James Cook producing a pair of touchdowns last week, the Chiefs still allow a league low 14.87 fantasy points per game to the position. Regardless of what the numbers say, James Cook, he wasn't that good. Of his 19 fantasy points, 63% of those came on those 2 touchdowns. Kansas City, they held Cook to 5 receptions for just 7 yards. Heck, he had 9 rushing attempts in which he only produced 20 yards. Fantasy points are great, but they only tell a portion of the story on the odd occasion. With that being said, if you want the full story, head over to RotoBaller.com, where you'll find all the latest news and analysis, and head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel, where you'll find me there 24/7 answering all your fantasy football questions. See you next time.